Good evening. Thanks for tuning in to Sister for Sisters Story Time again. It's your sister ChayaFyah. Today I'm going to be reading or starting to read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Becoming God in Ancient Egypt. And this is published by the Oriental Institute Museum of the University of Chicago. Okay. So the ancient Egyptians made significant investments in their preparation for the afterlife. Although this may appear on the surface as a fascination with death, it was in fact everlasting life that preoccupied the Egyptian mind. The ancient Egyptians believed that with the proper preparation, any living person could become an immortal divinity after death. To ensure such an outcome, a massive funerary industry developed to supply individuals with the necessary materials for their post mortem resurrection. Magical spells and religious incantations meant to transform the deceased person into an illuminated spirit endowed with impressive powers were ubiquitously inscribed on items in the mortuary assemblage. Such spells were gathered together and inscribed on long scrolls of papyrus to create what we now know as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is one of the most important religious compositions ever written and rightly deserves a place on our bookshelves alongside the text of other belief systems from the last 4,000 years of human history. While there has been much discussion about how the ancient Egyptians envisioned their relationship with the gods after death, the title of Book of the Dead, spell 80, was very explicit in this regard. The spell was called a spell for becoming a god, or neter, and served as the inspiration for the subtitle of this book. This catalog and its accompanying exhibit are dedicated to showing how the ancient Egyptians used religious literature, the Book of the Dead, more specifically, as a means to alleviate their mortal anxiety and control their destiny. It is designed to dispel common myths and invite new understanding about the Book of the Dead by presenting the latest results from research that has only appeared in specialist publications. Furthermore, like the spell for becoming a god, the overall approach within this volume is to listen to the ancient Egyptians in their own words and let our interpretations help rather than hinder them to speak. Goals for the exhibition catalog. Over the last 20 years, scholars have made great strides in their understanding of the Book of the Dead through large database projects, Totenbuck Project, Bond, and Trismegistos, that attempted to catalog all the known copies held in museums across the globe, and through a sharp increase in the availability of newly published manuscripts. Publishers and museums have capitalized on these trends, as demonstrated by the British Museum's blockbuster exhibit, Journey Through the Afterlife, Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead in 2010, the Garstang Museum's Book of the Dead, Passport Through the Underworld in 2017, the Fitzwilliam Museum's one day only display of the Book of the Dead of Ramos, and soon to appear, the Oxford Handbook of the Book of the Dead, currently in press. Lucarelli and Statler forthcoming. Several major new studies have also appeared in just the last 10 years by Carrier, Quirk, and O'Rourke. These publications complement and help to distill for the non technical reader the results derived from major scholarly series projects such as Handschriften des Altägyptischen Totenbuchs, Studien zu Altägyptischen Totentexten, Toten Bustex, and Bishraj Zoom Alton Egyptian. I know I messed that up. The time is ripe to reflect on what we think we know about this incredibly important piece of literature, summarize that knowledge for non-experts, and conceptualize new questions. This catalog presents the life story of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead from beginning to end, focusing on its form, purpose, transmission, production, and use through a collection of chapters authored by leading experts in the field. The Egyptian Book of the Dead has remained one of the hallmarks of ancient Egyptian culture. As Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia notes, the religion and the funerary beliefs of ancient Egyptians are so popular in our own culture that they have become the archetypal representation of the pharaonic civilization. Isis, Osiris, the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the Book of the Dead, not to mention the pyramids or the mummies, are well known even for the general public, and they continue to capture the imagination of artists since the origin of Egyptology as a modern science at the beginning of the 19th century. While most people have heard of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, many popular conceptions are misleading or based on erroneous understandings of what the Book of the Dead was, how it was used, and what happened to it. The Book of the Dead is often misunderstood as a book in the common sense modern notion, example, bound pages and a narrative structure, but the format of the Book of the Dead could vary greatly. Ancient Egypt did not have bound books, but rather used long scrolls of papyrus for their extensive literary output in many different languages and scripts. These scrolls would have resembled modern books in the sense that they often contained text that could be unrolled and read for leisure or study. However, the Book of the Dead was not a singular, undifferentiated work. Each manuscript was a collection of many spells from different sources. Each manuscript was handmade, and no two manuscripts were exactly the same. They often contained different selections of spells. The spells could be arranged in various sequences. Some were highly illustrated with colorful images corresponding to the text. Others contained only a few vignettes. In fact, Book of the Dead spells were more commonly found on other objects such as funerary figurines, ushaptis, scarabs, magical bricks, shrouds, and tomb walls. Therefore, the Book of the Dead should probably be associated less with our concept of a book, but rather bring to mind how information is shared on the internet in an ever-changing flow without static additions. Indeed, the web has even revived the format of the scroll for the organization of text. The spells that make up these books of the dead had long and complex histories. The origins of these religious compositions are far more ancient than those of any other known religion in world history. While Egyptian religious literature was never governed by the concept of canonicity, use of funerary spells can be traced over a period of 2,500 years. In 1842, Carl Richard Lepsius published a Book of the Dead manuscript for which he numbered each of the spells, a numbering which we continue to use when identifying these spells today. It is important to realize that these numbers are arbitrary and reflect the organization of a single papyrus. Additionally, there are numerous funerary compositions that accompany Book of the Dead spells for which no numbers have been assigned. All of these factors can therefore disguise the variability and creativity displayed in manuscripts of the Book of the Dead, and it may be more useful to think of ancient Egyptian books of the dead to account for the fact that the Book of the Dead was not a book at all. Just as the spells gathered together in the Book of the Dead had diverse origins, so too did they have diverse purposes. Although the primary intention of the spells was to aid the deceased in their transition to the afterlife, this aim could take many forms. Some spells were quite utilitarian. They were meant to ward off potentially harmful creatures, including snakes, scorpions, crocodiles, demons, and other dangerous spirits, such as BD 39. Other spells were of a more theological and spiritual nature, having been designed to transfigure the dead into a blessed state. In fact, spells from the Book of the Dead were believed to result in the deceased mystical union with the gods of creation, allowing those lucky enough to obtain resurrection to join with the sun god himself and partake in the solar Osirian cycle. The solar Osirian cycle refers to the way the sun god Re and the chthonic god Osiris represented different aspects of the ordered world. Re or Ra represented the creative powers of daylight, while Osiris represented the power of regeneration. Each night, Re joined with Osiris in order to be rejuvenated the next morning. Likewise, the deceased sought to join this cycle so that each night his soul, or Ba, would join with his mummy to guarantee resurrection. In many spells, the deceased proclaim their identity with these gods. As they recited incantations such as I am Osiris, the firstborn of the gods, eldest of the gods, heir of my father Geb. I am the Lord of all. I am Osiris. The deceased sought union with these powers to overcome death and achieve everlasting life. The complexity of the Book of the Dead is also reflected in its different uses. The knowledge necessary to writing, copying, and producing of Book of the Dead spells would have been restricted to elite groups of priests. However, these priests would have worked alongside illustrators, wood carvers, stone workers, and other craftsmen in the funerary workshop. The Egyptians did not hesitate to use redundancy by inscribing Book of the Dead spells on nearly any available space in the burial. Spells can be found on the linen wrappings of the mummy, on amulets placed inside the wrappings, on the walls of coffins and sarcophagi, on papyri placed near the mummy and sometimes wrapped around the mummy itself, on magical bricks placed at the cardinal points in the tomb, on ushabtis meant to carry out work in the afterlife, or Ta Sokar Osiris figures used to encase papyri, and on the walls of the tomb itself. This redundancy brings us back to the notion that the Book of the Dead was not a book at all, but should rather be viewed as a modern designation of a changeable group of religious compositions employed in ancient Egyptian culture in a wide variety of ways. I strove to illustrate this fact in the structure of this catalog and in the design of the exhibit. The chapters which follow lay out the primary thematic issues involved in the study of the Book of the Dead. All the objects on display in the exhibit are treated individually at the end of the catalog and organized according to the layered arrangement of spells around the body in the burial chamber. My intent is to provide the reader and the viewer with the unique chance to appreciate the Book of the Dead in its archaeological context and to understand the intricate meaning associated with this layering. The objects used to illustrate this meaning derive primarily from the collection of Egyptian artifacts at the Oriental Institute Museum, with significant loans from the Field Museum of Natural History. An effort was made to incorporate as many unpublished or rarely displayed artifacts as possible. As such, a great breadth of geography and chronology is represented, which may lead one to erroneously believe that the Book of the Dead was the same at any time or in any place. That was certainly not the case. However, it is hoped that the treatment of the most important issues thematically, while being sensitive to the cultural context of any given piece, offers the reader the best chance at deriving a new and more nuanced understanding of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. A final note should be made about the contents of the catalog. It is inevitable in a catalog on a relatively restricted topic for which multiple experts have been invited to summarize the latest research results that there is some repetition. I hope you find some repetition helpful to establish context for the reader, especially those who may not read this catalog linearly from cover to cover, and not too distracting for those with a background in the material. Likewise, since it is unlikely that many will read straight through the catalog entries in the back, the reader may find a few topics repeated in other places in order to provide a well-informed catalog entry. Often the reader is referred back to those areas in the catalog. In other cases, more detailed is provided in the catalog entry than anywhere else. Overall, this repetition is minor, but where it occurs, I anticipate many readers find it useful. I'm going to skip over the acknowledgments and the contributors. The timeline of Egyptian history, cultural period, Paleolithic period, 700,000 to 7,000 BP. Pre-dynastic period, 5300 through 3000 BC. Nakata IC through three periods, 3200 through 3000. Dynastic periods, 3000 through 332 BC. Early dynastic period, Old Kingdom, first attestation of pyramid text, first attestation of coffin text, first intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period, New Kingdom, third intermediate period, and the late period. Then we have the Greco-Roman period, 332 BC through AD 395. The Ptolemaic period, than the Roman period. And last is the late antique period, or the Coptic period, 200 AD through 1000. What is the Book of the Dead? When most people think of the Book of the Dead, they think of the large, well-illustrated papyrus scrolls, such as the famous Papyrus of Ani, or Annie. However, the use of the modern title Book of the Dead is very misleading, as what we call the Book of the Dead is a far more variable and complex set of texts. In fact, the Book of the Dead is not a book in the modern sense of the term, neither in narrative concept nor in physical format. Modern books with their bound pages are descendants of the codex, a format in which a medium such as parchment or papyrus was folded and cut to produce facing pages. Groups of these pages were then gathered together and sewn through the folded edge to produce the book block. A cover of wood or leather would have been attached as a protective covering for the pages inside. The codex format became common in ancient Egypt, only after the 2nd century AD. Up until then, and for a time afterward, the primary format for books in ancient Egypt was the papyrus scroll. Making a papyrus scroll was a labor-intensive undertaking. Long stalks of papyrus had to be harvested, cut, trimmed, and then beaten with a mallet into thin, flat strips. These strips were overlain on each other lengthwise and further pounded, allowing the gum resin in the papyrus plant to act as a natural binding agent. This process produced a thin sheet, yet too fragile for writing on. An additional sheet was used as a second layer, laid over the first sheet with the fibers of the papyrus at a perpendicular angle to the first sheet, resulting in a sturdy page. On one side, the fibers ran left to right horizontally. This side was generally considered the front, also called the recto. used for the beginning of a text so that the writing ran in parallel to the papyrus fibers. The other side with the fibers running vertically was generally considered the backside, also called the verso, in which written text ran against the grain of the papyrus. Depending on when and where they were made, these sheets of papyrus were often fashioned to roughly standardized sizes, the full height of which could vary between around 30 to 50 centimeters. To produce a scroll, these individual sheets, which can be thought of as our modern book pages, were attached together by overlapping their edges, sometimes reinforced by additional papyrus strips. For Book of the Dead manuscripts, the scroll was often produced first and the text and illustrations added later to the complete scroll. However, certain examples, such as the Papyrus of Ani, clearly show that the individual sheets of papyrus were first inscribed and illustrated and then attached together to form the scroll as a second step. The text and images on the scroll could be the work of a single scribe or an entire team of scribes and artists. The finished product would have served the same basic purpose as the modern book, a medium to record, preserve, and store textual information. Unlike a book, however, the scroll would have been rolled up for storage. A protective sheet of blank papyrus was often joined to the outside edge to protect the beginning of the text from damage. Like manuscripts of the medieval period, each Book of the Dead manuscript was a handmade, unique object. No two are exactly the same, although those produced in the same funerary workshops bear many similarities. If no two Books of the Dead were identical, what exactly did the textual composition consist of? The title Book of the Dead is a modern designation derived from the German name Totenbuch, or Totenbuch, used in the 19th centuries, itself perhaps influenced by the Arabic phrase kutub al-Amwat, books of the dead, used by Egyptian villagers to describe papyri found in tombs. Ancient Egyptians called the composition the Book of Going Forth by Day, or the spells for going forth by day. Going forth by day refers to the soul, called the Ba, in the Egyptian language, with its ability to leave the tomb, fly out into the daylight, and join the sun god in his journey across the heavens. Book of the Dead, spell 15b, section 3, elaborates on the concept of going forth by day. As for any spirit for whom this book is made, his soul goes forth with the living. It goes forth by day. It is mighty among the gods. The title Book of Going Forth by Day was not a technical title, and it actually did not designate a single particular book. It was a generic designation that could be applied to nearly any funerary composition that served a similar purpose and in fact had already appeared in the coffin text and continued to appear in the Ptolemaic period in the books of breathing. Even the individual spells within the Book of the Dead carried the title. This so-called book, however, is not a singular narrative composition with a beginning and an end. Rather, the Book of the Dead is a compilation of many smaller texts. These smaller components are referred to as spells, both in the ancient text and by modern scholars. Further echoing the comparison with books, some publications also refer to the individual spells as chapters. Each individual spell was essentially a self-contained unit with its own theme and structure. Some spells are very long, such as Book of the Dead spell 17, otherwise abbreviated BD 17. A style you find throughout this and other publications. Other spells are very short, such as BD 6, the Ushabti spell. Individual spells were often, although not always, combined with specific illustrations referred to as vignettes, which provided a visual component to the spells' content. The most famous of these vignettes is the judgment scene accompanying BD 125, in which the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Maat in the Hall of Osiris. Some spells, such as BD 16, consisted only of the illustration itself. This figure 1.4, the Ba or soul of Nefertpet, is shown returning to the corpse in the tomb at night and a vignette from his funerary papyrus. Since the Book of the Dead was a collection of individual compositions, by extension, the Book of the Dead therefore appears on many other media beside papyrus, as each spell could be inscribed alone or in groups of spell sequences. Spells were inscribed on every form of media available, including papyri, leather, linen bandages, cartonnage, mummy cases, coffins, sarcophagi, funerary figures, stelae, magic bricks, and even on the walls of the tomb. In fact, the Book of the Dead spells were often inscribed in all these places for an individual with the means to afford it. This created an embedded redundancy by surrounding the dead within a magical cocoon and ensured that if the spells from one copy were damaged, a second or third copy was available to effect its magical intent. This metaphor of wrapping the dead in magical spells had a very literal physical manifestation. Book of the Dead spells were frequently written on linen shrouds or bandages and then wrapped around the corpse. Just as with papyri, the layout and format changed and developed over time and place. In the Ptolemaic period, it was especially common to inscribe the spells on thin linen strips in wide columns of hieratic text accompanied by illustrations. When many spells were included, a large number of strips would have been used, both to accommodate all the spells, but also to fully wrap the body. Several rare examples attest to a practice of plastering a Book of the Dead papyrus directly to the mummy, and it appears that the spells were laid out on the papyrus to coincide with their placement over particular body parts. The mummified body could be inserted into a casing made of cartonnage, a semi-hard shell formed from layering sheets of linen and papyrus covered with plaster. Cartonnage mummy cases and coffins alike served as important canvases for funerary decoration and text. Book of the Dead spells were commonly applied to these objects, ranging from spell excerpts to entire sequences consisting of dozens of spells inside and out. During eras when the production of Book of the Dead papyri waned, such as the time between the 22nd and 25th dynasties, it is likely that inscribing spells on coffins and related mortuary material served as the primary means for transmitting them. A wooden board fragment from a 25th to 26th dynasty coffin bottom, now in the Oriental Institute, shows just how extensive this decoration could be. The horizontal rows of cursive hieroglyphics that appeared on the interior of the coffin begin with an offering formula and transition into BD1. The spells on the backside from the exterior of the coffin contain BD 89 and 90. Similar such coffins could be covered with an essentially complete copy of the Book of the Dead containing dozens of spells. Recent research has even shown the papyri from the 25th dynasty may have been copied using coffins as the model for the Book of the Dead. The largest canvas for the Book of the Dead was the walls of the tomb itself. Carving the spells and their illustrations in stone must have been a tremendous investment, but could produce a long-lasting, oversized copy that would have been striking to see in full color. It was common for kings and queens of the New Kingdom to inscribe sets of spells either on objects in the mortuary assemblage or, especially in the later New Kingdom, in stone on the walls within their burial chambers. Since no Book of the Dead papyri belonging to a pharaoh are thus far attested, it is likely that the spells on the walls and objects in the tomb were the primary copies for these kings. Some of the most spectacular copies on tomb walls derive from the 25th to 26th dynasties and it seems that the same priests who were copying older texts for application on coffins were doing likewise for the tomb. The appearance of the Book of the Dead spells on individual objects within the funerary assemblage raises some interesting questions about the development, use, and transmission of the Book of the Dead. Many of the spells have obvious origins in the corpora of funerary compositions that had preceded them, namely the pyramid text and coffin text. Separating the spells into pyramid text, coffin text, and Book of the Dead spells is an arbitrary convention of modern scholars, as it is clear that the ancient Egyptians saw all of these compositions on a single continuum, even if they had popular presentation in particular contexts, such as in pyramids, on coffins, or on papyri. This fragment of a cartonnage mummy case is decorated with BD spell 18, which wished for Thoth to justify the deceased against his enemies, just as he justified Osiris against his. Egypt, Thebes. Other spells did not derive directly from these earlier texts. In the few cases where we have evidence of a spell's origin, this evidence often points toward the fact that the classic Book of the Dead manuscripts probably played a secondary role in their origin and transmission. Many spells contain instructions on their use that do not call for their incorporation into a larger papyrus compilation. These instructions were commonly written in red, like the titles of the spells, and are referred to as rubrics, a term derived from Latin rubrica, red ochre, in reference to the use of red to highlight specific letters in medieval manuscripts. In certain cases, the rubrics describe how the spell was intended to be used in conjunction with a particular amulet. For example, BD 30B is a spell for preventing the heart from condemning a man in the judgment hall. The associated rubric instructs that the spell is to be written on and recited over a scarab made from green stone. It is likely, therefore, that the written version of this spell originated as an amuletic text employed with these particular artifacts, and it probably had a longer history of oral transmission for which we have no written evidence. The spell would have then only secondarily been incorporated into manuscripts with large collections of spells that we know as the Book of the Dead. Support for this reconstruction is found in particular for BD 30B. Some of the earliest attestations of spells from the corpus designated as the Book of the Dead consist of copies of BD 30B found on heart scarabs from the 13th dynasty, prior to any attestations of the spells on papyrus. Thus, the earliest attested Book of the Dead spell is not on a Book of the Dead at all, but on a heart scarab. A similar hypothesis of transmission can be proposed for many other spells. Recent scholarship on BD 151, a group of spells inscribed on magical bricks, has demonstrated the existence of separate traditions for versions found on bricks versus copies found on papyri. BD 6, the so-called Ushapti spell, clearly had a very particular purpose associated with funerary figurines. This association was so close that there is even a specific variation of the spell known only from the funerary figurines of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. Of course, when these spells were first written down, there was probably a complex interaction between single spells written on sheets of papyrus as memory aids or templates versus the use of the text on the amulets themselves. For the Book of the Dead, variation was the rule. Manuscripts were individually handcrafted objects. Spells could appear alone as part of short sequences or in massive collections of more than 160. Any surface capable of being inscribed acted as a medium for their transmission. Each spell itself had many different variations and versions, some nearly unrecognizable when compared next to each other. A comparison of the text on Papyrus Ryerson with Papyrus Milbank demonstrates how different even two contemporary manuscripts can be from one another. Some compositions we label as individual spells did not even have a stable text at all. For example, despite extremely divergent texts, the designation BD15 has been applied widely to nearly any solar hymn, while Neville designated any Osirian hymn as BD 185. This demonstrates the elusiveness of defining exactly what a Book of the Dead is. It is one of those objects that seem to confirm the rule. We know it when we see it. Looking closely at the format and contents of the Book of the Dead reveals a complexity glossed over in most popular notions of it, and the necessity of nuance when trying to separate our modern interpretations of what it meant and how it worked from the ancient understanding that produced it. Both approaches can be useful, but it is easy to be led astray by our modern bias and the confusion that can often result from the complexity of the scholarly apparatus erected to buttress our conclusions. When all of the above is taken into consideration, it is clear that answering the question, what is the Book of the Dead, is very different from answering the question, what was the Book of the Dead? In many ways, the Book of the Dead is a modern construction of our imagination. Our conceptions are dictated by the way we categorize the text, how we privilege particular formats, what we see as the ultimate purpose, and even what name we give to the ancient compositions. In most of these cases, our conceptual apparatus for discussing and understanding this material is radically different than that of the ancient Egyptians themselves. In some ways, this is inevitable, but it is important to keep in mind the different perspectives. Our modern concepts can help us articulate our advances in interpretation, but they can also mislead us into misinterpretations, applying intentions, messages, or conclusions that never existed in the ancient mind. Figure 1.A is a funerary figurine Ushabti of Pharaoh Ramses III. Chapter 2, the origins and early development of the Book of the Dead. The modern term Book of the Dead is a misnomer in a number of ways. Yet scholars of ancient Egypt continue to employ the term in two distinct senses. First, the Book of the Dead denotes the relatively large corpus of mortuary text that were typically copied onto papyrus scrolls and deposited in burials of the New Kingdom, a custom that continued with further significant elaboration into later periods of Egyptian history. Second, the term can refer to an individual papyrus roll inscribed with a selection of such spells. No one such book contains all known spells, but only a judicious sampling, and no single Book of the Dead scroll is identical to another. The individuality represented by these scrolls may reflect the personal preference of the owner or the judgment of the scribe who composed it, as some examples were prepared well in advance, with blanks left in the text for the later insertion of the owner's name. Certain spells were more frequently copied than others, and some seem to have been deemed virtually essential, such as the ubiquitous BD spell 17. Certain groups of spells often appear together in a fairly predictable and routine sequence. The ancient title given to these scrolls, which can occasionally be found written on the exterior of the rolled papyri, is the Book of Coming Forth by Day, reflecting the Egyptians' belief that the spells were provided to assist the deceased in entering the afterlife as a glorified spirit or Akh. The notion of movement or coming forth by the deceased person refers explicitly to the mobility of the ba, an essential element of every individual that was believed to become enabled at death. By virtue of the power by virtue of the proper observance of the funerary rites, the Ba would become fully functional, able to move between this world and the next, while the deceased, as a transfigured Akh, would be ensured participation in the daily renewal and rejuvenation of the cosmos. In this sense, Scrolls of Transfiguration would be a closer description of the form and ancient purpose of such books of the dead. The utterances of the Book of the Dead were first compiled by Carl Richard Lepsius using a well preserved papyrus in the Turin Museum of Ptolemaic date 332 through 30 BC as his fundamental reference. The title of his seminal work, Das Tatenbuch der Ägypter, has since been universally adopted as the descriptive term for this collection of spells. Lepsius's collation was systematically expanded and codified over 40 years later by Edward Neville, who added 71 other papyrus sources of New Kingdom date as comparanda. Neville's expanded numbering system has since been augmented to identify additional spells that have come to light more recently. It is these texts, now amounting to over 190, that have collectively come to define the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. The funerary corpus of the Book of the Dead is not an entirely new assemblage of ritual text. A number of its spells emerged in whole or in part out of earlier collections of ritual utterances that have been designated somewhat artificially by the terms pyramid text and coffin text. Like the Book of the Dead, these two earlier corpora were classified and studied by Egyptologists on the basis of the types of monuments on which they were most prominently inscribed. The pyramid texts appear carved in monumental hieroglyphics on the interior walls of pyramids of the late Old Kingdom, circa 2375 through 2181 BC. These spells were first collated by Kurt Seth and numbered according to a series that roughly followed the chronological sequence of the five pyramids with inscribed walls known to him at the time. By contrast, the coffin texts were mostly written in ink using a small scale cursive hieroglyphic script. Arranged in vertical columns on the interior walls of private wooden coffins dated as early as the second half of the 11th dynasty, circa 2055 through 1985 BC. These coffins are now mostly held in numerous museum collections worldwide. Beginning in 1935, Adrian de Buck began the publication of a series of volumes that now numbers 8, arranging in all known spells of the corpus in numerical order and comparing text variants against one another. Eventually, owing to the subsequent excavation or discovery, new spells identified as either pyramid text or coffin text have been added to the initial sequences established by Seth and de Buck. As a case in point, Seth's original sampling of 5 pyramids has now grown to 10. Some of these sources await full publication. Not all known spells have yet been numbered or classified. It has long been recognized that there is significant continuity between these early corpora. Fully a third of the coffin text spells are descended from the pyramid text, reused verbatim or in partially revised form. The coffin text publication of the book tended to obscure the continuity of this textual tradition by omitting those pyramid texts that were found embedded among coffin text and including only spells that appear for the first time on coffins. However, several texts recently discovered in Old Kingdom pyramids and elsewhere are ones that the book originally identified as coffin text, which must now be recognized as having earlier use. New research into the funerary monuments of Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom date will undoubtedly bring other shared pyramid text and coffin text spells to light, further increasing the evidence for commonality between these two assemblages and diminishing any sharp distinction between them. And yet, the coffin text introduced a number of innovations in presentation and content that distinguished them from their Old Kingdom precursors. Due to the much smaller scale of coffin walls, these texts are no longer rendered as carved hieroglyphics, but as handwritten script, usually cursive hieroglyphics that sometimes approach scribal hieratic forms. The closely spaced columns are headed by the diagram DDMDW recitation, emphasizing their primary purpose as an utterance to be spoken aloud, not simply read. Brief titles or colophons are added to some utterances to explain the efficacy or proper performance of a ritual, and the content of certain spells seems to reflect the spoken rhetoric of non-religious texts of the period, including private biographies or even letters to the dead. The very nomenclature pyramid text and coffin text, respectively, has had an unintended but pervasive effect on scholarly narratives regarding the spread of mortuary practices in ancient Egypt. For most of the last century, it was generally accepted that the oldest known funerary texts were composed in the Old Kingdom exclusively for the glorification of the dead king and carved in royal burial apartments beginning with the 5th dynasty pyramid of Unas. With the demise of the Old Kingdom, ritual funerary texts were supposedly taken over by a wider and less exclusive audience consisting of private officials who placed them on their coffins along with Osirian terminology and symbols of royal regalia, thus democratizing them with the benefits of the royal ritual now spread to commoners. This appropriation, in theory, also reflected a corresponding decline in royal prestige and power. Recent reassessments of the cultural context of early writing and ritual practice in Egypt suggest that this view can no longer be sustained. A number of pyramid texts were clearly composed from the perspective of a non-royal individual or refer to the king as someone other than the beneficiary of the spell itself. From the mortuary temple of one of Una's predecessors, King Sahura, circa 2487 through 2475 BC. Fragmentary offering lists contain phraseology similar to what is found in the mortuary service of the pyramid text, indicating an earlier and more diverse royal usage for these recitations than burial purposes alone. In the private sphere, several tomb biographies of officials of the Old Kingdom as early as the 4th dynasty, circa 2613 through 2494 BC, refer to their status as an Ak, a glorified spirit, or assert that rites of transfiguration have been performed for them on earth. Moreover, an indispensable motive of Old Kingdom private chapels is the tabular menu of food offerings, implicitly tying these lists to the later pyramid text spells that accompany them and pointing to a common comprehension of funerary practices by royalty and commoners alike. The seemingly popular embrace of royal mortuary text on private coffins beginning toward the end of the 11th dynasty then is not one of misappropriation, but should be seen primarily as a shift in the practice of including textual materials in elite burials where they had not existed before. In this case, on private coffins rather than on the walls of contemporary royal pyramids, which at this time were no longer inscribed with funerary text. Despite such inevitable changes in the burial practices and commemoration of royal and non royal social classes, the fundamentals of funerary belief throughout Egyptian history represent, by and large, a continuous and unbroken tradition having the same essential purpose for the deceased: transfiguration into an effective spirit. Figure 2.3, coffin text spells 953 through 955, inscribed on papyrus Gardiner III in hieratic, showing the use of black ink for the main text and red ink for rubrics. Nor were inscribed utterances confined to pyramids or coffins, out of sight and out of reach of the uninitiated, but were visibly present in other locations such as stelae, funerary chapels, burial chambers, offering tables, items of mortuary equipment, and archival master copies. Spells composed for a glorified eternal existence attest to universal beliefs about the afterlife shared by most or all Egyptians, not just those able to commission pyramids or coffins on the basis of rank or wealth. The use of durable materials by the elite of ancient Egypt favored the preservation of pyramid text and coffin text into modern times, but this happenstance does not imply that mortuary customs and ritual were not available to other members of society. In addition to their physical presence in the tomb and on other objects, religious text corpora existed more importantly on a separate and more significant plane, that of ritual performance. It is no accident that most of these spells are couched as direct speech, where their function is primarily performative and their place is primarily among the living, one that leaves few traces in the archaeological record. That is, textual sources that have survived the passage of millennia give us vital insight into the funerary practices of ancient Egypt, but do not entirely define them. It is in light of this perspective that the development of the Book of the Dead arising in the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate Period and continuing into the early 18th dynasty should be assessed. In an ongoing evolution of beliefs about the afterlife, the Book of the Dead draws directly on the textual tradition of the pyramid text and coffin text, adopting several utterances wholesale, revising others, and adding new spells that must have been more recently composed. Its physical manifestation in the New Kingdom as a papyrus scroll differs radically from the pyramid walls and wooden coffins of prior eras, but its essential purpose to guarantee the post-mortem transfiguration of the tomb owner into a glorified spirit remains the same, and its direct evolution can be traced from a number of disparate monuments beginning in the 13th dynasty, circa 1773 through 1650 BC. To follow the earliest emergence of the Book of the Dead, a distinction must be made between the appearance of isolated spells on coffins of the Middle Kingdom and the identification of recognizable text sequences that foreshadow the beginning of a new mortuary tradition. Several coffins of the 13th dynasty include individual utterances mixed in with coffin text that later appear as part of the Book of the Dead repertoire. For example, the coffins of Sesinimnef from Lisht, Senib Henoef, Abydos, and Emini, perhaps Asiut, contain intermediate versions of certain utterances. For example, BD spells 33, 102, 123, 139, 148, and 149 that are akin to coffin text counterparts but have not yet developed their typical New Kingdom forms. For the dating of these coffins, the earliest datable version of what we can recognize as a codified arrangement of text surviving into the New Kingdom appears on the inner walls of the rectangular coffin of a Queen Mentuhotep, the wife of King Jehudi, who ruled toward the end of the 13th dynasty or the very beginning of the 16th dynasty. The coffin has been lost, but its texts were copied by Sir John Wilkinson in 1832. Surprisingly, the form of the script breaks from the expected Middle Kingdom custom of small-scale cursive hieroglyphics, formally arranged in vertical columns and written in retrograde fashion. Instead, the spells are written out of multiple horizontal lines of flowing cursive hieratic script in 10 sections or pages, uncannily imitating the appearance of a papyrus scroll. The spells themselves also anticipate a developing canon. They include a number of coffin texts mixed with new compositions that commonly occur on later Book of the Dead papyri. More to the point, the spells are arranged in a sequence typical of the New Kingdom, beginning at the head end of the coffin with coffin text 335, which was to emerge as the Book of the Dead utterance 17, often used as the opening spell on later papyrus scrolls. Nor is Mentuhotep's coffin the only example. A fragmentary coffin board in the British Museum belonging to an official Heronefer is similarly inscribed in hieratic with coffin text 335, doubtless from the head end of the coffin and intended as the first of a sequence of spells similar to that of Queen Mentuhotep. Hieratic, therefore, seems to be the script with which the earliest codification of Book of the Dead spell sequences was formulated, not just presumptively on papyrus master copies kept in local archives, but also as copied directly onto the walls of rectangular coffins like those of Mentuhotep and Heronefer. Such a master copy, although of the early 18th dynasty, seems to exist in the more durable leather roll inscribed for Nebims, composed in 10 sections of scribal hieratic and containing a string of spells typical of Queen Mentuhotep's coffin and other early Book of the Dead sources. This leather roll served its purpose for a considerable time before the name of Nebims was finally written into the spaces that had been left blank in the master copy to allow for the insertion of the owner's name. The broad adoption of anthropomorphic coffins during the Second Intermediate Period was to impose significant changes in the physical inclusion of text on coffins. A transition most evident in the Theban region on the orientation of the body in these coffins. The curved side walls and lids of these human-shaped containers made it difficult to accommodate the number of funerary spells that were once copied out on flat interior walls. One unique monument, the fragmentary coffin lid of the princess Sat-Jehudi Sat-Tibu of the late 17th dynasty, circa 1580 through 1550 BC, illustrates how scribes attempted to deal with this limitation while still preserving the custom of copying spells directly onto the coffin. The upper portion of Sajahudi's lid is carved in high relief, depicting the face of the deceased, while the flat underside displays the text of 4 spells composed in her horizontal lines in a sequence well attested for the Book of the Dead. This tentative solution was apparently deemed insufficient, since otherwise it seems to have been entirely abandoned. Spells from the nascent Book of the Dead corpus were instead consigned to media other than coffins, papyrus scrolls, and linen sheets, which could accommodate more extensive textual material and then be rolled up or draped over the body lying within the coffin. The majority of inscribed linen shrouds, notably that of 17th dynasty Queen Tetisheri, the direct ancestress of the rulers of the 18th dynasty, predate any Book of the Dead source written on papyrus, but both materials were used concurrently for several generations before the Book of the Dead achieved its final incarnation as an illustrated papyrus scroll. Smooth sheets of papyrus were the ideal medium for hieratic script, reflecting normal scribal usage from as early as the First Dynasty, from circa 3000 BC. And hieratic scrolls certainly served as the prototype for copying spells onto coffins like those of Mentuhotep and Harunefer. Moreover, the use of hieratic to inscribe Book of the Dead utterances on papyrus continued into the joint reign of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Two burials of this period, those of Hatnofer and of Nofer-Quawet, contained Books of the Dead written entirely in a proficient hieratic hand. The latest datable examples known: three other papyrus scrolls of the early 18th dynasty, those of Mesen-Neter, Muti, and Ahmose, shown a combination of compositional approaches in which a single section or page of horizontal lines is combined with hieratic or cursive hieroglyphic forms arranged in vertical columns. Small sketches of the solar bark of BD spell 126 are incorporated with the text of Muti and Ahmose as well, incipient vignettes that were drafted deftly in black ink with only minimal detail. Simultaneously, during the 17th and 18th dynasties, circa 1850 through 1425 BC, linen became broadly employed as a surface on which scribes could copy out spells from the Book of the Dead, despite the challenges of writing on a flexible woven ground. A few of these linen shrouds bear spells in hieratic script arranged in vertical columns, such as those of Ahmose Pinhet in the Metropolitan Museum, the Prince and Chancellor Ahmose in the Turin Museum, and Ahmose Hinut Tamihu in the Cairo Museum. More numerous are shrouds composed in columns of cursive hieroglyphs, usually in retrograde orientation, a format essentially identical to that used in Middle Kingdom coffins, though some are composed to be read in the clear as well. None of these shrouds bear hieratic writing in horizontal lines typical of scribal usage, perhaps due to the open weave and stretchable surface of the linen, which may have militated against the flowing ligatures so distinctive of horizontal hieratic and favored scripts, in which signs are individually rendered. The option of either papyrus or linen imposed different parameters for writing and layout. While papyrus was normally produced in standard sizes measuring 30 to 36 centimeters high and pasted together as needed, linen sheets were routinely woven many meters in length and more than a meter wide, affording a more expansive medium for composition and drafting. It is on linen shrouds that painted big nets, one of the distinguishing marks of the Book of the Dead, first appear in far greater frequency and variety than on papyrus, often predominating over the text in some cases, doubtless due to the virtually unlimited space available. One such shroud, inscribed for Ka and his spouse Taperet, features a number of vignettes that are well attested illustrations of the Lake of Fire, BD spell 126, the underworld mounds, BD spell 150, the funeral cortege of the mummy being hauled to the tomb, BD spell 1, and 2 scenes of adoration by the owner and his wife, while the corresponding text of these spells had been added only in cursive snippets. The more complete Shroud of Amenhotep is arranged in 3 long horizontal registers, each subdivided into 9 sections, adorned with no fewer than 25 vignettes, with text composed in retrograde cursive hieroglyphic script. The compartmentalized format is quite unlike anything that exists on papyri of the time. Other fragmentary pieces of sheeting confirm the impression that linen rather than papyrus served as a primary vehicle for the innovative layout of vignettes in broad registers and their integration with text, as with the Shroud of Amenemhab, a combination that was to find more refined realization in Book of the Dead papyri or the 18th dynasty. The sequence of most of the spells that constitute the Book of the Dead corpus would not become formally fixed until the Saite period after 664 BC, remaining unchanged thereafter and thus designated by scholars as the Saite recension. By contrast, it has been remarked that the early versions of the Book of the Dead, referred to as the Theban recension, were more haphazard and less subject to standardization. While there is a great deal of variety in the sequence in which spells were arranged in these early sources, even the duplication of spells on a single papyrus, the selection is not entirely random. On papyri of the 18th dynasty, 8 strings of spells have been noted that are often found grouped together, though not in precisely the same order, and an effort has been made to identify the internal coherence of these associated utterances. For example, those having to do with transformations into different efficacious beings, utterances for coming forth by day, or other free movement, incantations against inimical beings, and spells for the heart. 3 of these sequences also occur regularly on the papyri and linen shrouds of the formative period of the late 17th and early 18th dynasties, demonstrating an adumbrating link to the later books of the dead. On the other hand, 3 additional sequences among this formative group of papyri and shrouds can be identified that rarely occur, if at all, in later 18th dynasty sources. BD 27, 14, 39, 65, 116, 91, 64. These latter sequences suggest not only a clear internal coherence among those early exemplars for the Book of the Dead, but also a subsequent shift in spell usage once the more canonical format of the papyrus scroll came into exclusive use, beginning in the later reign of Thutmose III, circa 1479 through 1425 BC. The provenance of the early papyrus and linen textual materials point to the area of Thebes as the location where the Book of the Dead was first formulated. Following the separation of Upper Egypt from Northern Egypt at the end of the 13th dynasty and the beginning of the Theban 16th dynasty. Notably, the coffin of King Jehudi's queen, Mentuhotep, dates to this chronological crux, and the evidence from the early linen shrouds is supportive of this observation. Of the 16 largest shrouds, 10 were discovered at Thebes, and 3 more can be deduced to come from that locale. The owners of these shrouds include Queen Titishiri, 2 princesses, Atmos, one of them the daughter of the 17th dynasty king Sequenenri, Sequenenra Tau, at least 2 princes Atmos, and 2 other individuals whose names are compounded with Amos, a naming tradition distinctly of the Theban region at the time. It is likely that the reformulation of funerary practices at this time was not an isolated cultural phenomenon. It was accompanied by the introduction of a new pottery repertoire, continuing unbroken into the New Kingdom. and the appearance of rishi coffins adorned in a feather pattern that may have reference to CT 335 and BD 17. As already observed, the New Kingdom Book of the Dead Scrolls co-opted a significant number of utterances from the pyramid text and coffin text, but this newly codified tradition embraced novel thematic and structural features as well. Titles in red ink regularly herald the beginning of spells, foregrounding the content to come. The geography of the underworld and the denizens that guard its divisions are described in greater detail, and the deceased boast of having the arcane knowledge by which these guardians can be pacified and passed by. The papyri are routinely, often exquisitely illustrated with multiple vignettes executed in vibrant colors, which themselves can stand alone for the utterances to which they pertain, though a few papyri contain vignettes executed only in the scribal colors of red and black. The formal judgment of the dead contained in BD Spell 125 is an entirely new addition to the mortuary corpus and involves the deceased supplicant making a negative confession, asserting his or her faultless behavior on earth in the presence of 42 gods assembled in the hall of the two truths, while the heart is weighed against the feather of Mayat. Another large vignette shows the tomb owner and often his wife in adoration of Osiris or another deity, frequently opens the papyrus scroll. Beginning roughly with the later reign of Thutmose III, the custom of copying spells onto papyri in ordinary hieratic script was abandoned. A curious development, in which of the fact that hieratic writing was the natural medium for papyrus and could be employed by any scribe with access to the pertinent religious sources, and perhaps because book rolls could contain vastly more textual and figural material than linen sheets, inscribed shrouds had only a limited shelf life as a primary carrier of mortuary spells. However, they continued to be part of 18th dynasty burial equipment at least into the reign of Amenhotep III, circa 1390 through 1352 BC, the most notable example being the one inscribed for Thutmose III. Instead, for almost the entire duration of the New Kingdom, individual books of the dead were largely produced at significant expense by master draftsmen, scribes, and painters who were trained in the cursive and formal hieroglyphic traditions. Traditions of writing, who could lay out spells with appropriate spacing, who could draft vignettes according to the prescribed artistic norms, and who had access to pigments, all in response to the preferences of an individual who had the means to commission such a prestigious work. In other words, these funerary scrolls represent a particular form of lavish display in tomb equipage, a luxury item that could only be afforded by the relatively wealthy. At the same time, the option of a more modest papyrus roll inscribed in hieratic was abandoned. New Kingdom books of the dead, as products of privilege, were not intended to restrict accessibility to rituals to that select sliver of society who could afford to include an illuminated scroll among their funerary equipment. As already noted, the ownership of ritual compositions in a burial context is insufficient grounds for assuming that the rituals themselves were beyond the reach of others. Commoners undoubtedly had access to those requisite ceremonies and recitations suitable to their means, meager as they might be. But the typical Book of the Dead, as it emerged in the mid 18th dynasty, was fundamentally an item of elite cultural production for which a less expensive substitute in the form of a hieratic papyrus scroll was no longer produced, reflecting a preferential change in custom or fashion. Although spells associated with the Book of the Dead have been defined as such by virtue of their appearance on funerary book rolls, they were widely deployed on other objects associated with burial. The close integration of ritual utterance with the physicality of the tomb and its associated equipage is eloquently attested by the wide-ranging application of Book of the Dead spells in different loci. Ushabti figurines, figure 2.8 BD spell 6, heart scarabs, figure 2.9 BD spell 30B, mummy mask and magic bricks, BD spell 151, various amulets to be placed on the body's stele and tomb or chapel walls. Nor were the spells on papyrus the only or primary mortuary compositions of the New Kingdom. While the broad range of funerary compositions known as the books of the netherworld becomes evident in royal tombs during the later New Kingdom, even private monuments of the early 18th dynasty provide a glimpse of the variety that were available to non-royalty. Funerary liturgies in the burial chamber of Senenmut TT 353, Amduat, and portions of the Litany of Ra in the burial chamber of Usuramun TT 61, and a range of BD spells and PT utterances in the burial chamber of Amenemhat TT 82. The richness of funerary practices of the time cannot be fully assessed without positioning the Book of the Dead in relation to other lengthy contemporary treaties, which together presents a much more complex picture of the Egyptians' beliefs concerning the afterlife and cosmology than extant sources provide for early periods. To be sure, the origins of the Book of the Dead are rooted in a broadly received corpus of religious texts dating back to the Pyramid Age, but its full emergence by the middle of the 18th dynasty cannot be understood purely as a textual or literary phenomenon. The gradual revision and codification of mortuary recitations, culminating in lavish papyrus manuscripts illustrated by vignettes and produced for the Egyptian elite of the New Kingdom, proceeded hand in hand with the alignment of ritual practice and the physical aspects of burial arrangements over a period of markedly changing taste and requirements, stretching from the late Middle Kingdom through to the early 18th dynasty, combined with the impetus imparted by an independent Theban political entity in southern Egypt. All right, we're going to end it right there. Catch me back here tomorrow for chapter 3. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Peace.